Hey guys, what made a medieval home unpleasant was not usually one dramatic source of filth, but the way dozens of ordinary, sensible things slowly merged into an atmosphere that modern people would find almost impossible to ignore. If you're watching tonight, let me know where you're listening from, and tell me what piece of history you'd like us to explore next. And if you enjoy thoughtful long-form history like this, a quiet like really does help support the channel. If you'd like more calm, curious journeys into the past, subscribing is a simple way to keep them coming. To understand why medieval homes smelled so much worse than most people imagine, it helps to begin with a simple correction. The smell was not there because people were uniquely dirty, uniquely careless, or somehow indifferent to discomfort. In many cases, the opposite was true. Medieval households worked constantly to manage smells, smoke, waste, dampness, and decay. The problem was that they were doing so inside a material world with very different limits. Houses held smoke because heat mattered more than ventilation. Floors held moisture because stone, earth, and straw behaved differently from modern surfaces. Clothing held sweat because washing fabric was laborious. Food left traces because preservation was difficult. Animals came close to people because survival depended on it. What we might describe as poor hygiene was often, from their point of view, a practical compromise between competing needs. And that is one of the first things modern viewers often misunderstand. A bad-smelling house was not necessarily a neglected house. It might instead be an active, hard-working one. In much of medieval Europe, the home was not a sealed, specialized environment in the modern sense. It was not purely a place for sleeping and private family life. It was a workshop, a kitchen, a storehouse, a shelter, and very often a place where people, animals, tools, clothing, food, and fuel remained in close contact. Even when wealthier homes had more rooms and somewhat clearer divisions of space, the principle remained the same. Daily life compressed many functions under one roof or within one tight cluster of buildings. The result was not just clutter. It was a layered atmosphere. The first layer was smoke. This was perhaps the most constant smell in many homes, and probably one of the least avoidable. Open hearths were central to domestic life. They provided warmth, light, and a place to cook. But burning wood, peat, charcoal, or whatever fuel was locally available did not produce the clean, almost invisible heat that modern people are used to. It produced thick air, soot, and a smell that settled into beams, rafters, cloth, hair, and skin. In earlier or poorer dwellings, the hearth might vent imperfectly through a simple opening in the roof, if at all. Even with a chimney, smoke often lingered. A room could be warm enough to survive in and still smell deeply of combustion. There was an irony here. The very feature that made a home habitable in winter also made it oppressive to breathe in. A house that smelled strongly of smoke was often not failing at its purpose. It was succeeding at the more urgent task of keeping people alive. Then there was the floor. The image many people carry of medieval interiors is often shaped by castles, churches, or carefully restored heritage sites, but most people did not live on polished stone under tidy museum lighting. Many lived with beaten earth floors, rough boards, scattered straw, or rushes laid down to make a room warmer and slightly softer underfoot. On paper, rushes sound almost pleasant, even rustic. In practice, they could trap spilled ale, scraps of food, grease, mud from boots, animal droppings, and whatever else passed through the room over days and weeks. Some households changed them regularly when they could. Others did not. And even in better-kept homes, the idea of a floor covering that absorbed the life of the household was itself a recipe for smell. The smell, too, was not one single odor. It was a shifting mixture. Sour drink, old grease, damp plant matter, tracked in earth, ashes, wet wool, and bodies moving repeatedly through the same enclosed air. The home was not just occupied. It was constantly being impressed upon by use. Animals added another layer, and again, not always because people preferred it that way. Livestock represented wealth, food, transport, power, and security. Keeping animals nearby made practical sense. Chickens, pigs, goats, and sometimes larger animals might share space with humans or stay very close to the dwelling, especially at night or in cold weather. Even when they were technically outside, their smells were not far away. Manure heaps, stables, dung used for fuel or fertilizer, and the damp organic odors of animal life formed part of the everyday environment. For peasant households especially, the boundary between human domestic space and animal domestic space could be much thinner than modern people are comfortable imagining. This is where the subject becomes more revealing than it first appears. The smell of a medieval home was not only about cleanliness. It was about economy. If an animal was near the home, it was near the center of survival. If manure was present, it was not merely waste. It was also future fertility for the fields. If leather, wool, or skins gave off strong odors, that was because households lived close to the materials that clothed them and sustained them. Convenience, comfort, and separation were luxuries, and sometimes very expensive ones. Food contributed its own persistent presence. Cooking smells are comforting to us largely because they rise and disappear through modern ventilation, and because modern kitchens are separated from bedrooms, storage spaces, and living rooms. Medieval cooking often took place in the same broad environment in which people sat, worked, and slept. Boiling pottage, roasting meat when available, frying in fat, baking coarse bread, drying fish, storing onions, preserving cheese, brewing ale, and keeping salted or smoked food all left traces in the air and on surfaces. Fat splattered. Smoke bound itself to everything. Barrels, sacks, crocks, and hanging provisions each carried their own scent. A house could smell of cabbage one day, salted fish the next, then stale ale, sour milk, or broth thickened with grains and herbs. And because food spoiled more easily, unpleasant smells could emerge quickly. A modern kitchen can hide a great deal behind refrigeration and sealed containers. A medieval household could not. The difference between edible and suspect was often monitored by smell, texture, and experience. That meant people lived closer to the edges of sourness and rot, not because they were careless, but because they had to. Bodies, of course, mattered too, though here again the lazy stereotype gets in the way of the truth. Medieval people did wash, though not always in the way modern audiences imagine, and not with the same frequency, privacy, or convenience. Full bathing might be irregular, shaped by season, class, labor, modesty, fuel costs, and local custom. But washing hands, face, and visible skin was hardly unknown. The deeper issue was that people lived in clothing worn for long periods, worked physically, heated spaces with smoke, and slept in rooms with limited airflow. Linen undergarments could absorb sweat, but they too required labor to wash. While outer garments, blankets, and bedding gathered odors over time. Hair picked up smoke. Skin held the smell of work, animals, kitchens, and the street. Even a respectable, orderly household could never fully escape the scent of human presence. This becomes easier to picture when we remember that medieval homes were often busy with motion rather than stillness. People came in carrying wet cloaks, muddy shoes, chopped wood, produce, tools, or market goods. Children moved through the space. Servants or household members cooked, cleaned, spun, mended, sorted, and stored. The home breathed in the outside world all day, then held it overnight. Waste disposal made everything harder. Urban households faced one set of problems, rural households another, but neither existed within anything like a modern sanitation system. Chamber pots had to be emptied. Privies had to be managed. Drains were crude, inconsistent, or absent. Streets outside could carry refuse, wastewater, and animal filth, and that smell did not stay politely outdoors. In towns especially, a home's atmosphere was shaped partly by whatever happened beyond its walls. Nearby workshops, tanning, butchering, cesspits, rotting debris, stagnant water, and the accumulated waste of crowded living. Sometimes the foulness people encountered indoors had already begun outside and simply drifted in or clung to clothes and shoes on the way back. There was also the problem of damp. Medieval buildings were in a constant argument with weather. Rain found cracks, cold settled into stone, timber absorbed moisture. Thatch could shelter beautifully when maintained, but no organic roofing material was immune to age, leaks, or decay. Wet while drying indoors, cloaks hung near the fire, rushes darkened by moisture, cellars with a heavy earthy chill, walls touched by mildew or trapped condensation. These contributed a quieter, heavier smell than smoke or waste, but often one that lingered longer. It is one thing to imagine a smoky room. It is another to imagine smoke mixing with wet fabric, muddy footwear, and the sweet-sour scent of organic matter that never fully dries. Even attempts to improve the smell could create new layers rather than erase the old ones. Herbs were strewn, flowers used, incense burned, perfumes applied, and pleasant-smelling plants hung or stored. These practices were real and not merely decorative. People understood odor as socially meaningful and often medically significant. But covering a smell is not the same as removing its cause. Lavender, rosemary, juniper, or other fragrant materials might freshen a room for a time, yet what they often produced was a more complicated atmosphere. Sweetness floating over smoke, herbs settling into damp cloth, resin rising above stale bedding. It may have been an improvement and sometimes a welcome one, but not the clean reset a modern aerosol can promises. Class changed the experience but did not remove the problem entirely. Wealthier households had larger spaces, better separation of functions, more servants to manage washing and waste, more textiles, more access to imported fragrances, and sometimes more advanced architectural features such as chimneys, enclosed privies, and glazed windows. But wealth brought its own smells too. Richer diets, more candles, more bodies in service, more stored goods, more fabrics, more furnishings able to trap odor. Great halls could smell of roasted meat, dogs, rushes, damp wool cloaks, torch smoke, and crowded company. Nobility did not live in a modern hotel. They lived in a world where luxury softened discomfort but rarely abolished it. And perhaps that is the deeper point. The medieval home smelled worse than modern people imagine, not because medieval people lacked standards, but because the home itself carried burdens we have long since pushed elsewhere. We moved animals out. We moved filth underground into sewers. We moved smoke into hidden systems. We moved butchery, tanning, brewing, and heavy craft labor into separate buildings. We insulated walls, sealed windows, invented detergents, standardized waste removal, and separated kitchens from bedrooms. We are used to a house that conceals the mechanics of living. Medieval people lived much closer to those mechanics. Once you start to see that, a medieval interior stops looking merely dirty and starts looking unusually honest. It reveals in the air itself what the household is doing to survive. And yet there is another part of this story that makes the domestic smell even more difficult to escape, because it has less to do with floors or hearths and more to do with the intimate spaces people slept in, the fabrics they lived among, and the long night hours when all of those trapped odors settled more heavily into the dark, night. The medieval home did not simply become quieter. It became denser. The warmth from the hearth, now banked low or allowed to fade, left behind a stillness in the air that held everything in place. Smoke that had drifted upward during the day no longer moved as freely. Dampness settled. The faint sourness of fabric, the lingering trace of cooked food, the the slow presence of bodies at rest. All of it seemed to gather rather than disperse. Sleeping arrangements played a quiet but important role in this. Most people did not sleep in large, airy, well-separated rooms. Space was limited, and warmth mattered more than privacy. Beds were often shared, sometimes by multiple family members, sometimes by servants, sometimes even by guests if circumstances required it. This was not seen as unusual. It was efficient, conserved heat. It made use of limited space. But it also meant that the smells of breath, sweat, clothing, and bedding were concentrated in ways that modern listeners may find difficult to picture. Bedding itself was not a neutral surface. Mattresses could be filled with straw, feathers, wool, or other available materials, each with its own qualities. Straw, while practical and inexpensive, absorbed moisture and could begin to smell if not regularly replaced. Feather beds, prized for comfort, could still trap warmth and odor over time. Blankets and coverings, often woolen, held the smells of the room and of the people using them. Washing large textiles was labor-intensive, requiring water, fuel, time, and physical effort. It was done, but not with the frequency or ease that modern systems allow. There is a subtle contradiction here. Medieval people often valued fresh air, light, and cleanliness when they could achieve it. Windows might be opened during the day. Bedding might be aired when the weather allowed. Yet the very structure of life, crowded sleeping, shared fabrics, limited washing capacity, meant that the night reversed much of that effort. What had been aired out in daylight slowly absorbed the accumulated reality of the household again. And the night introduced another factor, the absence of distraction. During the day, smells were part of activity. People moved, worked, cooked, spoke, and focused on tasks. At night, lying still, those same smells could feel more present. Not necessarily more intense, but more noticeable. A faint dampness in the straw, the lingering smoke in the rafters, the warmth of bodies under shared coverings. These became part of the sensory background of rest. This helps explain something that might otherwise seem puzzling. For medieval people, the threshold of what counted as an unpleasant smell was different, not because their senses were weaker, but because their expectations were shaped by constant exposure. A modern person stepping into such an environment might feel overwhelmed. A medieval inhabitant might register the same environment as normal, perhaps even comfortable if it signaled warmth, shelter, and familiarity. Familiarity itself is important here. The smell of one's own home, even if complex or heavy, becomes part of its identity. It signals belonging. It distinguishes inside from outside, known from unknown. In a world where travel was slower, spaces were more stable, and personal environments changed less frequently, the scent of a household could become as recognizable as its layout or its inhabitants. It was not simply endured. It was, in some sense, lived with and understood. But this familiarity had limits, and those limits often became visible when people moved between environments. A traveler entering a different household, a guest staying overnight, or a servant working across multiple homes would have experienced the contrasts more sharply. One house might carry more smoke, another more dampness, another more animals, another more food storage. These differences could signal wealth, occupation, regional habits, or even the recent events within a household. A room that smelled strongly of herbs might indicate recent attempts to freshen it. A space with a sharp sourness might suggest spoiled food or neglected cleaning. In this way, smell functioned almost as a form of quiet information. It also intersected with ideas about health. Medieval understandings of disease often linked illness to bad air, a concept that was not entirely misguided, even if it lacked the scientific framework we have today. People noticed that certain smells were associated with sickness, decay, or unhealthy environments. Efforts to manage odor through ventilation, burning herbs, or avoiding certain places were not only about comfort but about perceived safety. The line between unpleasant and dangerous was not always clearly drawn, but it was sensed. This adds another layer to the experience of the home at night. A room that smelled too heavy, too stagnant, or too unfamiliar might not just be uncomfortable. It might feel subtly threatening. Opening a shutter, stirring the fire, or adjusting bedding could be small acts not only of comfort but of reassurance. And yet, despite all of this, the medieval home was not a place people constantly rejected. It was, for most, the center of life, work, and rest. It was where stories were told, where food was shared, where children were raised, where illness was endured, and where ordinary routines unfolded day after day. The smells that accompanied it were inseparable from those experiences. There is a tendency, when looking back, to isolate the unpleasant aspects and imagine them as overwhelming. But in reality, they were woven into a broader sensory world that included warmth from the fire, the texture of wood and cloth, the dim light of candles, the sounds of movement and conversation, and the rhythms of daily life. Smell was only one part of that world, even if it is the part that feels most distant to modern sensibilities. Still, there were moments when that balance shifted, when the ordinary smells of a home became something heavier, more difficult to ignore. Periods of illness, for example, could alter the atmosphere dramatically. The presence of sickness often brought with it new odors, sweat, decay, unwashed bedding, medicinal herbs, and the confined air of a room where someone remained for long stretches of time. In such moments, the limits of medieval domestic life became more apparent. Similarly, seasonal changes could intensify certain smells. In warmer months, decay accelerated. Food spoiled more quickly. Waste became more pungent. Flies gathered. In colder months, homes were sealed more tightly against the weather, trapping smoke and moisture inside. Each season reshaped the sensory environment, sometimes subtly, sometimes quite noticeably. Urban environments added yet another dimension. In a town or city, the smells of individual homes did not exist in isolation. They blended with the broader atmosphere of the street. Workshops, markets, waste disposal, and human density all contributed to an environment where indoor and outdoor air were closely connected. A home might carry not only its own internal smells, but also those of its neighbors and the wider community. This meant that managing the smell of a home was never entirely within the control of the household itself. It depended on weather, on neighbors, on the layout of the street, on the presence of trades, on the flow of waste, and on countless small variables that shifted over time. Even the most diligent household could not fully separate itself from its surroundings. And so, when we imagine a medieval home smelling worse than we expect, it is not just because of what happened inside its walls. It is because those walls were more permeable physically, socially, and environmentally than the ones we are used to. The home was not a sealed unit. It was part of a larger living system. As we move further into this system, it becomes clear that some of the strongest and most persistent smells were not tied to the obvious sources like waste or animals, but to the materials people relied on every day, materials that carried their own hidden processes of transformation, preservation, and slow decay, often unnoticed until they began to shape the air itself in more subtle ways. One of the most persistent of these materials was leather. It was everywhere in medieval life: boots, belts, straps, pouches, harnesses, containers, and yet the process that created it was far from neutral. Tanning, especially in its earlier and more common forms, involved substances that modern audiences would likely find difficult to tolerate even at a distance. Animal hides had to be soaked, scraped, and treated to prevent decay, and this often meant the use of urine, lime, and organic tannins derived from bark or plant matter. Even when the most unpleasant stages of tanning took place outside the home, the finished products carried a residual scent. A house with multiple leather items, especially if they had been recently made or were exposed to damp, could hold a faint but persistent odor that was neither entirely foul nor entirely pleasant. It was simply present, blending with everything else. In a sense, leather was a success story. It represented durability, utility, and resourcefulness. But it also carried with it a reminder of the processes required to transform raw materials into usable goods. Textiles told a similar story, though in a quieter way. Wool, in particular, was central to medieval clothing and domestic life. It was warm, versatile, and widely available, but it also had its own natural oils and its own way of interacting with moisture. Even after processing, wool retained a faint animal scent, especially when wet. Cloaks hung to dry near the fire, blankets used night after night, garments worn through labor and only occasionally washed. These created a background presence that was not sharp or immediately offensive, but deeply embedded in the environment. Linen, often worn as an underlayer, was easier to wash and helped absorb sweat, but it too required careful handling. Washing linen meant hauling water, heating it using alkaline substances like lye, and then drying the fabric in conditions that were not always ideal. If linen was dried too slowly or stored damp, it could develop a sourness that lingered. In this way, even the materials intended to manage cleanliness could contribute to the complexity of a home's atmosphere. Wood, the structural backbone of many homes, added another dimension. Fresh timber carried a natural scent that could be pleasant, even calming. But as it aged, absorbed smoke, and interacted with moisture, it changed. Beams darkened with soot. Surfaces absorbed the oils of hands, the residue of cooking, and the dampness of the air. Over time, the house itself became a repository of its own history, holding on to smells long after their original source had faded. A spilled pot of broth, a season of heavy smoke, a period of damp weather. All of these could leave traces that lingered in the grain of the wood. And then there were the more hidden materials, the ones that did not draw attention to themselves until they shifted. Stored grains, for example, could carry a faint earthy smell when fresh, but if conditions turned slightly too warm or too damp, that smell could deepen into something heavier. Mice or insects might find their way in, leaving behind their own traces. A storage chest that seemed perfectly ordinary could quietly alter the air around it over time. Salted meats and fish, essential for preservation, brought their own presence as well. Salt itself did not eliminate smell. It transformed it. A piece of preserved fish might be entirely safe to eat, yet still carry a strong, lingering odor that seeped into nearby materials. Barrels used repeatedly for storage absorbed these scents, and each new use layered over the last. A household that relied heavily on preserved foods would carry that signature in its air. Candles and lighting added another subtle layer. Beeswax candles, used in wealthier households, burned relatively cleanly and carried a mild, almost sweet scent. Tallow candles, more common among the less wealthy, were made from animal fat and could produce a heavier, more noticeable odor, especially as they burned down. In a small or enclosed space, the difference between these two types of light could be felt not just in brightness, but in the quality of the air. Even ink, parchment, and the materials of writing, though less central to most households, had their own faint contributions. Iron gall ink, commonly used, carried a slightly metallic, acidic scent. Parchment, made from animal skin, had its own subtle presence. In a literate household or one engaged in record-keeping, these elements added yet another quiet note to the overall composition. What begins to emerge from all of this is not a single overpowering smell, but a layered environment in which each material contributes something small, and together they create something much larger. It is this layering that makes the medieval home feel so different from a modern one. Today, we are accustomed to isolating smells, to identifying a single source and removing it. In the medieval context, the sources were too numerous, too interconnected, and too necessary to be easily separated. There is also a deeper rhythm to how these smells changed over time. A home was not static. It responded to use, to weather, to the cycles of work and rest. After a day of heavy cooking, the air might feel thick and rich. After a period of airing out, it might feel lighter, though never entirely neutral. After rain, dampness would rise again. After a long winter, fabrics and materials might carry the accumulated weight of months spent in enclosed conditions. This rhythm meant that people were constantly adjusting, even if only in small ways. Doors opened when possible. Windows, where they existed, were used to encourage airflow. Bedding was shaken out, rugs or rushes replaced, clothing aired. None of these actions eliminated the underlying reality, but they managed it, keeping it within tolerable bounds. And within those bounds, people developed an understanding of what was normal, what was acceptable, and what required attention. A certain level of smoke was expected. A certain background of organic scent was part of life. But a sudden change, a sharper odor, a deeper dampness, a new sourness, could signal a problem. In this sense, smell functioned as a form of awareness, a way of reading the condition of the home. It is easy, from a distance, to imagine that medieval people simply endured these conditions without reflection. But the evidence suggests something more attentive. Household manuals, where they exist, include advice on cleaning, airing, and maintaining domestic spaces. Medical texts discuss the importance of air and environment. Even literary sources occasionally note the sensory qualities of interiors. These are not the writings of people indifferent to their surroundings. They are the writings of people working within constraints, trying to shape their environment as best they could. And yet, despite all of this effort, there remained a threshold beyond which the environment could become genuinely difficult. This was often most apparent in times of stress, when resources were strained, when illness spread, or when external conditions disrupted the usual rhythms of maintenance. In such moments, the delicate balance that kept a home's atmosphere manageable could begin to shift. A prolonged period of rain, for example, might prevent proper drying of fabrics and rushes. Food stores might begin to spoil. Waste might accumulate more quickly than it could be removed. The air would thicken, not dramatically at first, but gradually, until the change became undeniable. What had been a complex but familiar environment could tip into something heavier, more oppressive. Similarly, during times of scarcity, households might be forced to make compromises. Cleaning materials might be used more sparingly. Textiles might be worn longer between washings. Food that was slightly past its best might still be consumed. Each of these choices made sense in context, but each also contributed in small ways to the overall atmosphere. There is a quiet realism in this. The medieval home was not designed for ideal conditions. It was designed for survival within a particular set of limits. Those limits shaped not only how people lived, but how their environment felt, smelled, and changed over time. As we follow these layers further, it becomes clear that some of the most revealing aspects of the sensory world are not the obvious ones. The smoke, the waste, the animals, but the subtle interactions between materials, routines, and constraints that quietly defined what it meant to live inside those walls day after day. And within those interactions, certain domestic practices, ordinary, repeated, and often overlooked, played a larger role than they first appear, especially when it came to how households tried and sometimes struggled to keep their living spaces from slipping beyond that fragile balance. These practices were rarely dramatic. They were small, repeated adjustments, almost invisible in the rhythm of daily life, but they carried a quiet importance. Sweeping a floor, for instance, was not simply about tidiness. It was about removing layers before they had time to settle too deeply. A broom passed across rushes or wooden boards might lift loose debris, but it could not reach what had already soaked in. This meant that timing mattered. The sooner something was cleared, the less it would become part of the house itself. Water played a role here, though its use was always measured. Carrying water was labor, and heating it required fuel, which was itself a valuable resource. So washing surfaces, fabrics, or utensils was not done casually. It was done with purpose. Bowls might be rinsed and wiped, but a deeper cleaning would be reserved for moments when it felt necessary. Cloths used for wiping could themselves become sources of odor if not properly cleaned and dried, creating a quiet cycle where the tools of cleanliness needed their own attention. Ashes from the hearth were another part of this domestic system. They were not simply discarded. Ash could be used in cleaning, its alkaline qualities helping to break down grease and residue. Could be scattered, collected, repurposed. But ashes also carried fine particles that settled into surfaces and fabrics. Over time, even the act of cleaning introduced new layers into the environment, each one subtle but cumulative. Ventilation, when possible, was one of the most effective tools available, yet it was also one of the least reliable. Opening a door or window allowed fresh air to move through the space, carrying away some of what had built up. But this depended on weather, safety, and the structure of the building itself. In colder months, openings were kept small or closed entirely to preserve warmth. In crowded towns, the air outside might not be significantly fresher than the air within. A breeze could help, but it could just as easily bring in new smells from nearby activity. This created a kind of negotiation between comfort and relief. A slightly smoky, warm room might be preferable to a cold, cleaner one. A closed space might feel safer at night, even if the air grew heavier. These were not careless choices. They were decisions shaped by immediate needs. Clothing management formed another quiet layer of domestic practice. Garments were aired when possible, sometimes hung outdoors or near an open window. This helped release some of the accumulated scent of sweat and smoke. But airing was not washing, and its effects were temporary. Clothing returned to the same environment, worn again through work and daily movement, gradually reclaiming the atmosphere of the home. Shoes and boots, often damp or soiled from outdoor conditions, introduced their own challenges. Mud, manure, and street residue did not remain neatly outside. Even when footwear was removed or cleaned, traces could still be carried in. The threshold between outside and inside was not a firm barrier, but a shifting line that depended on habit and circumstance. And then there was the question of time. Not just the daily rhythm, but the longer accumulation of months and years. A home that had been inhabited for decades carried with it a deep layering of use. Surfaces worn smooth by hands, corners darkened by repeated contact, materials aged by smoke and moisture. All of these held onto traces of the past. In a sense, the house itself remembered. This is where the idea of smell becomes something more than immediate sensation. It becomes a kind of record, not a clear or readable one, but a presence shaped by everything that has happened within the space. Each meal cooked, each winter endured, each season of damp or dryness contributed something. Over time, these contributions blended into a background that was both familiar and difficult to separate into its parts. For those living within it, this background rarely demanded constant attention. It was simply there, part of the environment in the same way that the shape of the room or the texture of the floor was there. But when something shifted, when a new smell emerged, or an existing one intensified, it could stand out sharply against that familiar base. One example of this is the handling of waste within the home, particularly at night. Chamber pots, used for convenience and necessity, had to be managed carefully. When emptied regularly, they were simply another part of the routine. But when delayed even briefly, they could introduce a sharper, more immediate odor into the sleeping space. The timing of such tasks, often dictated by darkness, weather, or safety, could influence the atmosphere in subtle but noticeable ways. Similarly, cooking residues could linger longer than intended. A pot left uncleaned overnight, a spill not fully wiped away, a piece of food overlooked. These small details could alter the air by morning. In a modern setting, such changes might be corrected quickly with minimal effort. In the medieval context, they required time, water, and attention, all of which had to be balanced against other demands. There is also a quieter dimension to these practices that speaks to how people thought about their environment. Cleanliness was not always defined by the absence of smell, but by the absence of disorder. A well-kept home might still carry strong scents, but if those scents were expected, understood, and managed, they did not necessarily signal neglect. Disorder, unexpected smells, visible decay, uncontrolled accumulation, was more likely to draw concern. This distinction helps explain why certain practices were prioritized over others. Keeping tools in order, maintaining the hearth, ensuring that food was stored properly, managing waste before it became unmanageable. These were all part of a broader sense of domestic responsibility. Smell was one indicator among many, but it was interpreted within a wider context. In this way, the medieval home functioned as a system, one that required ongoing attention but rarely allowed for complete control. Each action taken to improve the environment interacted with other factors, sometimes helping, sometimes complicating. A fire that dried damp clothing also added smoke. A closed door that kept out cold also trapped odors. A layer of fresh rushes that softened the floor also began, over time, to absorb what fell upon it. What emerges is not a picture of failure, but of constant adjustment. A household was always in the process of becoming, never fully clean, never entirely unmanageable, always moving within a range shaped by effort and limitation. And it is within this process that some of the most revealing details appear. Not in the obvious extremes, but in the small, repeated moments when people made choices about how to live within their environment. Choices about when to open a window, when to replace bedding, when to clean more thoroughly, when to accept a certain level of discomfort. These choices, taken together, defined the sensory character of the home. They determined whether the air felt merely heavy or genuinely unpleasant, whether the space remained familiar or began to feel oppressive. And they reveal something essential about medieval life, that comfort was not a fixed condition, but something negotiated daily, within the boundaries of what was possible. As we move further into this domestic world, those negotiations begin to intersect with broader social patterns, differences between regions, between urban and rural life, between wealth and poverty. And it is there that the experience of smell begins to diverge in more noticeable ways, shaped not just by materials and routines, but by the larger structures that surrounded the home itself. In a rural setting, the smell of a home was closely tied to land. Fields, animals, weather, and distance all played their part. A peasant dwelling, often set within a working landscape, existed in constant conversation with its surroundings. The air outside might carry the scent of turned soil, manure spread for fertilization, damp grass, or nearby livestock. These were not distant or occasional smells. They were part of the environment in which the home was embedded. What this meant in practice was that the distinction between indoor and outdoor air was less pronounced. Opening a door did not necessarily invite something entirely new. It often allowed a familiar continuation of the same atmosphere, just shaped slightly differently by movement and space. A rural home might feel fresher than an urban one at certain times of day, especially with a breeze moving across open land, but it would still carry the organic character of its environment. There was also more room, both physically and socially, for certain smells to disperse. Outbuildings could be used to separate some activities. Animals might be kept just far enough away to reduce their immediate presence inside the main living space. Storage could be distributed across different structures. These small degrees of separation mattered. They did not eliminate the layered atmosphere of the home, but they could soften it. At the same time, rural life introduced its own intensities. During harvest, for example, large quantities of plant material were brought close to the home: grain, hay, vegetables, and herbs. These materials carried their own scents, often fresh at first, but capable of shifting quickly if conditions were not ideal. Damp hay could sour. Stored crops could rot. The smell of abundance could, under the wrong circumstances, turn into something heavier and more difficult to manage. In winter, the rural home often became more enclosed. Animals might be brought closer for warmth or protection. Supplies were stored more densely. Movement outside was reduced. The air inside thickened, not just from smoke, but from the accumulated presence of everything needed to endure the season. The contrast between the open, shifting smells of summer and the enclosed, layered atmosphere of winter could be quite noticeable, even if it was accepted as part of the yearly cycle. Urban environments, by contrast, created a different kind of pressure. Space was tighter, populations denser, and activities more concentrated. A house in a town was rarely insulated from its neighbors. Walls were shared, streets were narrow, and trades were often clustered together. This meant that the smell of one household could mingle with that of another, and both could be influenced by what was happening just beyond their doors. Certain trades were particularly influential. Tanning, dyeing, butchering, brewing, and metalworking each produced distinctive odors. In some cases, these trades were deliberately placed in specific areas of a town, but the separation was not always complete. A home near a tannery, for example, might experience a persistent background of strong, organic smells, especially in warm weather. A house near a market might carry the shifting sense of food, waste, and human activity. Water sources also played a role. Wells, rivers, and drainage systems varied widely in quality. Stagnant water, poor drainage, or the accumulation of waste in certain areas could create localized smells that affected nearby homes. In a dense urban environment, these conditions could change quickly, depending on weather, usage, and maintenance. And yet, urban life also offered certain advantages. Access to markets meant that fresh materials could be obtained more regularly, at least for those who could afford them. Specialized services, laundries, bathhouses, waste collectors were sometimes available, though their accessibility and effectiveness varied. These services could help manage certain aspects of domestic life, including smell, in ways that were more difficult in isolated rural settings. This creates an interesting contrast. The urban home might be more exposed to external smells, but it also had access to more tools for managing its internal environment. The rural home might be more self-contained, but it relied more heavily on its own resources and labor to maintain balance. Wealth, of course, influenced both contexts. In a rural setting, a wealthier household might have larger buildings, better materials, and more space to separate functions. In an urban setting, wealth could allow for more refined architecture, better ventilation, more frequent cleaning, and access to higher quality goods. But even in these cases, the fundamental conditions remained. The materials were still organic. The processes were still labor-intensive. The environment still imposed its own limits. There is also a cultural dimension to how these differences were experienced. Expectations varied not only by class, but by region and custom. What was considered an acceptable smell in one place might be seen differently in another. Practices around cleaning, airing, and managing domestic space were shaped by tradition as much as by necessity. A household might follow certain routines not because they were objectively the most effective, but because they were understood, inherited, and trusted. This helps explain why the experience of smell in medieval homes cannot be reduced to a single standard. It was not simply better or worse, cleaner or dirtier. It was varied, contextual, and deeply tied to the specifics of place and life. Travelers, again, provide a useful perspective here. Moving between regions, they would have encountered not just differences in language or architecture, but differences in atmosphere. A coastal town might carry the scent of salt and fish. An inland farming village might be dominated by earth and livestock. A dense commercial center might feel sharper, more crowded, more layered. Each environment had its own character, and each shaped the homes within it. And within these differences, there were moments when the contrast became especially clear. Entering a well-maintained household after time spent in a more crowded or less managed environment could feel like a relief, even if, by modern standards, the difference was modest. Conversely, moving into a space where the balance had tipped, where dampness, waste, or decay had begun to dominate, could feel immediately uncomfortable. These contrasts were not just sensory. They carried social meaning. A household that maintained a certain level of order, even within the limits of the time, signaled stability, competence, and care. One that did not might suggest hardship, neglect, or disruption. Smell, in this sense, was part of how people read each other's lives. It is also worth noting that the perception of smell could be shaped by expectation. A guest entering a noble hall might be prepared for certain scents, food, smoke, animals, and interpret them as part of the environment. The same guest entering a smaller, more crowded dwelling might interpret similar smells differently, not because they were objectively worse, but because they fell outside what was expected in that context. This interplay between expectation and reality adds another layer to the experience of medieval homes. Smell was not just a physical phenomenon. It was also a social one, interpreted through the lens of status, familiarity, and context. As we follow this thread further, it becomes clear that the experience of smell in the medieval home cannot be separated from the broader patterns of daily life. It is shaped by work, by season, by social structure, by material limits, and by the constant effort to maintain balance within those limits. And it is in the quieter, more personal spaces of that life, where people spent their evenings, their nights, and their moments of rest, that these influences come together most fully, revealing not just how homes smelled, but how they were lived in moment by moment within the constraints and rhythms of their time. And it is in those quieter moments, especially the late evening hours, that the full reality of the medieval home becomes easier to sense. Work slows, movement settles, the door is closed, the fire reduced, and the household gathers into a smaller, more contained space. What had been dispersed throughout the day begins to concentrate again, not abruptly, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. In that stillness, even ordinary details take on a different weight. A cloak drying too slowly by the fire releases a faint dampness that lingers. A wooden table, wiped but never fully stripped of its history, carries the memory of meals long finished. The air, no longer stirred by constant motion, becomes thicker, more unified, as if the house itself is exhaling everything it has held throughout the day. It is here that one of the more subtle contradictions of medieval domestic life becomes clear. The home was both a place of refuge and a place of accumulation. It protected its inhabitants from the cold, from the open landscape, from uncertainty. But in doing so, it also held on to everything brought inside. Every trace of work, every material necessity, every compromise made in the effort to live. This is perhaps most evident in the way air behaved in enclosed spaces. Without modern circulation systems, air did not move freely unless encouraged to do so. It lingered in corners, settled into textiles, and responded slowly to change. Even a small room could develop areas that felt slightly different from one another, warmer near the hearth, cooler near a wall, heavier where fabrics were thickest. These differences were not dramatic, but they were part of the lived experience, shaping how people arranged themselves within the space. Sleeping positions, for example, were not only about comfort but about warmth and, indirectly, about air. People might cluster closer together in colder weather, drawing shared heat, but also concentrating the atmosphere around them. In a larger hall, individuals might position themselves closer to the fire or further from drafts, creating small pockets of slightly different conditions within the same room. Over time, these habits became intuitive, part of an unspoken understanding of how to live within the space. There is also the matter of storage, which quietly influenced the atmosphere more than one might expect. Medieval homes did not have the luxury of extensive hidden storage. Goods were often kept within the same spaces where people lived and slept. Chests, shelves, hooks, and simple containers held clothing, tools, food, and personal items. Each of these contributed something to the air, however faint. A chest filled with wool garments might release a soft, lanolin-rich scent when opened. A sack of grain might carry a dry, earthy note. A bundle of dried herbs might offer a moment of sharp freshness. These individual scents could be pleasant in isolation, but within the enclosed environment of the home, they blended into something more complex. The act of opening a container, of moving or rearranging stored items, could briefly shift the balance, releasing a stronger wave of scent before it settled back into the background. Even the walls themselves played a role. In some homes, especially those constructed with wattle and daub, the materials were not inert. Clay, straw, and timber interacted with moisture and temperature, subtly influencing the air. In damp conditions, walls could feel and smell different, holding a faint earthiness that was not unpleasant on its own, but contributed to the overall density of the space. All of this points to a home that was constantly in a state of quiet interaction with its contents. Nothing was entirely separate. Materials influenced each other. Air carried traces from one part of the room to another. Time allowed those traces to settle and blend. And yet, within this complexity, people developed ways of navigating their environment with a kind of practical sensitivity. They learned which smells signaled something normal and which suggested a problem. They recognized the difference between the familiar heaviness of a lived-in space and the sharper edge of something beginning to spoil or decay. This sensitivity was not always conscious. It did not require formal knowledge or deliberate analysis. It was part of daily life, shaped by repeated experience. A householder might notice that a room felt close and open a door. They might sense that bedding needed to be aired or that food should be used before it turned. These decisions were small, but they maintained the balance that kept the home within livable bounds. At the same time, there were limits to what could be controlled. Weather, in particular, could disrupt even the most careful routines. A prolonged damp period might prevent proper drying, allowing moisture to settle more deeply into materials. A sudden cold snap might force doors and shutters to remain closed, trapping smoke and scent. These external pressures reminded households that their environment was not entirely their own to shape. There is a quiet resilience in how people responded to these challenges. They adjusted as conditions changed, shifting routines, making small compromises, finding ways to maintain comfort where possible. But those adjustments also reveal how close to the edge that balance could sometimes be. In certain circumstances, the atmosphere of a home could shift from manageable to overwhelming with surprising speed. A spill left unnoticed, a piece of food forgotten, a period of illness, a change in weather, each could tip the balance slightly. And because so many elements were interconnected, one small change could influence others. A damp floor might affect bedding. Bedding might influence the air. The air might affect how quickly other materials dried or decayed. What begins as a single issue could become part of a broader shift in the environment, one that required time and effort to correct. This interconnectedness is perhaps one of the most important aspects to understand. The medieval home was not a collection of separate problems, each with its own solution. It was a system, and any change within it had the potential to ripple outward. And within that system, some of the most revealing moments are the ones when people attempted not just to manage their environment, but to improve it in more deliberate ways. Moments when they went beyond routine, when they cleaned more thoroughly than usual, replaced materials earlier than necessary, or introduced new elements in an effort to shift the atmosphere. These efforts were not always successful in the way we might expect. They could lighten the air, refresh the space, or bring a temporary sense of relief. But they also interacted with the underlying conditions, sometimes producing results that were more complex than intended. It is in these attempts, these small acts of improvement, that we begin to see how medieval people thought about comfort, cleanliness, and the limits of their environment. Not as fixed states, but as goals to be approached, adjusted, and negotiated over time. And as those efforts become more visible, they begin to point toward a deeper question, one that sits quietly beneath the surface of all these details. Not just how medieval homes smelled, but how people judged when a home had crossed from ordinary discomfort into something that demanded attention, and what they believed could be done when it did. That threshold, when a home shifted from familiar to concerning, was not marked by a single rule. It was felt, and that feeling was shaped by experience, by habit, and by a quiet understanding of how far things could go before they began to interfere with daily life. A room that smelled strongly of smoke might be entirely acceptable in winter, but the same heaviness in warmer weather could feel wrong. Dampness that lingered for a day or two might be tolerated, but if it persisted, it began to suggest something deeper, something that might not resolve on its own. What is striking is how often the response to these moments was practical rather than dramatic. There was rarely an expectation of complete transformation. Instead, people turned to what was available to them: time, labor, and the careful use of materials. A space might be cleared more thoroughly than usual. Bedding might be taken outside, shaken, and left to catch what fresh air could be found. Fires might be adjusted not just for heat, but to dry the surrounding space. Small changes, repeated and layered, were the primary tools of improvement. In some cases, stronger measures were taken. Floors might be scraped back or entirely relayed if they had absorbed too much over time. Rushes could be removed and replaced more frequently, even if doing so required effort and resources. Walls might be repaired or refreshed, especially if damp had begun to take hold. These actions were not routine, but they were understood as necessary when conditions demanded them. There is a subtle logic here. A medieval household did not expect perfection, but it did recognize deterioration. And when that deterioration crossed a certain line, it triggered a response, not because of abstract standards, but because it began to interfere with the basic functioning of the home. Cooking, sleeping, working, and resting all depended on a space that, while imperfect, remained manageable. It is also worth noticing that these responses were often shared responsibilities. In larger households, tasks could be distributed among servants or family members. In smaller ones, the burden fell more directly on those who lived there. This meant that the condition of the home was closely tied to the capacity of its inhabitants. Illness, exhaustion, or absence could quickly affect how well a space was maintained. And this introduces another quiet layer to the experience of smell. It was not only a reflection of materials and environment, but also of human energy. A well-kept home required effort. When that effort was reduced, even temporarily, the effects could be felt in the air. There is a particular poignancy in this. The atmosphere of a home, something so immediate and physical, was also a reflection of less visible conditions: health, labor, stability. A room that felt heavier, more stagnant, might be telling a story not just about damp walls or stored food, but about the people within it and the pressures they were facing. This connection becomes especially clear during times of illness. When someone in the household fell sick, routines were disrupted. Cleaning might become less frequent. Bedding might remain in use longer than usual. The room itself might be kept more enclosed, either to preserve warmth or out of concern for the sick individual. At the same time, attempts to manage the situation, burning herbs, adjusting the fire, limiting movement, could alter the air in ways that were noticeable in such moments. The smell of a home could change in ways that were difficult to ignore. It was not just the presence of illness, but the way it reshaped the environment around it. And because medieval understandings of disease often linked it to air and environment, these changes carried a deeper significance. They were not merely unpleasant. They were potentially meaningful, even threatening. Yet even here, the response remained grounded in what was possible. Efforts were made to improve the air, to keep the space as balanced as circumstances allowed. Windows might be opened when it felt safe. Herbs might be used more deliberately. Bedding might be changed when it could be managed. These actions did not eliminate the problem, but they reflected a consistent attempt to work within the limits of the situation. This pattern, recognition, adjustment, and continued negotiation runs through much of medieval domestic life. It suggests a way of thinking that is both pragmatic and attentive. People did not expect to control their environment completely, but they did not ignore it either. They worked with it, responding to changes as they arose. And in doing so, they developed a kind of quiet expertise. Not a formal system, but a lived understanding of how materials behaved, how air moved, how smells shifted over time. This knowledge was rarely written down in detail, but it was passed through practice, through observation, through the repetition of daily routines. It is this lived understanding that makes the medieval home feel less alien when examined closely. The conditions were different, certainly, but the underlying effort, the desire to create a space that was livable, stable, and as comfortable as possible, remains familiar. At the same time, there is an important distinction to be made. Modern comfort often depends on removing or isolating problems. Medieval comfort, by contrast, depended on managing them within the same space. Smoke was not removed entirely. It was directed and reduced. Dampness was not eliminated. It was balanced and dried where possible. Odors were not erased. They were moderated, covered, or simply accepted when they fell within expected bounds. This difference shapes how we should imagine the sensory experience of these homes. Not as places overwhelmed by a single, unbearable smell, but as environments where multiple elements were held in a kind of uneasy equilibrium. An equilibrium that could be maintained with effort, disrupted by circumstance, and restored, at least partially, through careful attention. And it is within this shifting balance that we begin to see how deeply connected the home was to the broader world. The smells within its walls were not isolated phenomena. They were linked to agriculture, to trade, to weather, to social structure, and to the daily movement of people and goods. As those connections become clearer, the medieval home starts to appear less as a static interior and more as a point of convergence. A place where outside forces met the routines of domestic life, and where the resulting mixture shaped not only how the space smelled, but how it was experienced, understood, and maintained over time. And it is precisely at that point of convergence, where the inside and outside worlds pressed most closely together, that some of the most challenging and revealing conditions began to emerge, especially in the narrower streets and more crowded quarters where the boundaries of the home were tested most directly by everything happening just beyond its walls. In these tighter urban spaces, the idea of a separate home begins to blur even further. A door could be closed, a shutter drawn, but neither was truly a barrier in the way modern walls function. Sound carried, air moved slowly but persistently, and with it came a steady exchange of smells that no single household could fully control. A narrow street, especially in a busy town, was rarely still. People passed through with goods, animals, tools, and waste. Water was thrown out from upper windows. Refuse was carried or sometimes left where it could be managed later. The street itself became a kind of shared space of transition, where what belonged inside and what belonged outside was constantly negotiated. For the homes that opened directly onto these streets, this meant that the atmosphere inside was never entirely self-contained. A change in activity outside, a butcher at work, a cart of fish arriving, a sudden downpour stirring up what had settled into the ground, could subtly alter the air within. Even with doors closed, the presence of the street remained. This created a different kind of domestic awareness. Householders learned not only to read the condition of their own space, but to anticipate the rhythms of their surroundings. Certain times of day brought certain activities. Markets opened and closed. Trades operated on schedules that, while not strictly regulated, followed recognizable patterns. Knowing when to open a window, when to keep it shut, when to air bedding, or when to delay, these decisions were shaped as much by the street as by the room itself. There is a quiet complexity in this relationship. The home was not passive. It responded, but it responded within limits. A household could not choose its neighbors, nor easily change the nature of the surrounding area. A dwelling near a busy commercial street would carry that character, just as one near a quieter lane would reflect a different rhythm. Over time, this meant that different parts of a town developed their own sensory identities. Not in a formal sense, but in a lived one. People knew, often without needing to articulate it, which streets felt heavier, which felt more open, which carried certain persistent qualities. These impressions were shaped by many factors, but smell was among the most immediate. Within the home, this external influence could create a subtle tension. Efforts to maintain a certain balance inside might be challenged by conditions outside. A room carefully aired in the morning might take on a different quality by evening. Fresh rushes laid down on the floor might begin to absorb not only what fell within the household, but what drifted in from beyond. This does not mean that such homes were constantly overwhelmed. Rather, it suggests that their condition was more dynamic, more subject to change. The balance we have been tracing, the one maintained through daily effort, had to account not only for internal factors, but for a wider environment that was itself in motion. And yet, even in these conditions, people found ways to adapt. In some cases, architectural features offered modest assistance. Upper floors, for example, could provide a degree of separation from the immediate activity of the street. Windows placed higher up might catch cleaner air, or at least air less directly influenced by ground-level conditions. Overhanging structures, common in certain towns, could shape how air and light moved, creating pockets where the atmosphere felt slightly different. But these were adjustments, not solutions. The fundamental relationship between home and environment remained. It is also here, in these more crowded settings, that the contrast between expectation and reality becomes especially visible. A visitor entering a well-appointed urban home might still encounter an atmosphere that, by modern standards, feels heavy or layered. Yet within its context, that same space could represent a high degree of care, effort, and relative comfort. This contrast invites a reconsideration of what worse than you imagine truly means. It is not simply that medieval homes were unpleasant in a straightforward way. It is that they operated within a different sensory framework, one where the presence of smell was normal, expected, and interpreted through context rather than eliminated outright. And within that framework, there were moments when the balance tipped more noticeably, when the interaction between inside and outside, between material and routine, became harder to manage. Heavy rain, for instance, could transform a street into a channel of mud and runoff, carrying with it whatever had accumulated. The ground, saturated, would hold on to moisture, and the air would thicken. Inside the home, dampness would rise, affecting floors, walls, and fabrics. The usual efforts, airing, drying, sweeping, became more difficult. The environment pressed inward, and the distinction between manageable and uncomfortable narrowed. In warmer conditions, the opposite pressure could occur. Heat intensified smells, accelerated decay, and encouraged the presence of insects. A street that had been tolerable in cooler weather might feel sharper, more immediate. Inside, food spoiled more quickly, and the air responded accordingly. Again, the household adjusted, but within constraints. These seasonal and environmental pressures did not arrive as sudden disruptions. They unfolded gradually, often predictably, yet always requiring attention. They formed part of the ongoing negotiation that defined domestic life. And through it all, there remained a kind of continuity. Despite the variations between rural and urban settings, between wealth and poverty, between seasons and circumstances, the medieval home shared a common characteristic. It was deeply connected to the world around it, and its atmosphere reflected that connection at every moment. This connection becomes even more apparent when we consider how people moved between these environments. A person leaving their home and stepping into the street, or traveling from one part of a town to another, carried with them traces of where they had been. Clothing, hair, and skin acted as carriers of scent, blending the identity of one space into another. In this way, the boundary of the home extended beyond its walls, not physically but sensorially. The smell of a household could accompany its inhabitants, just as the atmosphere of the wider environment could follow them inside. It is a subtle but important point. The medieval home was not a sealed container, but part of a continuous exchange. And that exchange shaped not only how spaces smelled, but how they were perceived, remembered, and understood. As we continue to follow this thread, the focus begins to shift slightly, from the broader interaction between home and environment to the more intimate ways in which individuals experienced and interpreted these conditions in their own daily lives, and how those personal experiences, in turn, influenced the small decisions that kept the entire system in motion. For the individual living within this environment, the experience of smell was rarely isolated from the experience of everything else. It was not something observed from a distance, but something encountered continuously, folded into movement, work, and rest. A person did not step into a room and pause to evaluate its atmosphere in the way a modern visitor might. They entered, adjusted, and continued, their awareness shaped less by sudden contrast and more by gradual familiarity. This familiarity, however, was not uniform. It varied with age, occupation, and even time spent outside the home. Someone who worked regularly in fields or open air might notice the heaviness of an enclosed space more readily upon returning. Someone who spent most of their time indoors might experience that same space as stable and expected. The difference was subtle, but it influenced how people responded to their surroundings. Children, for example, often moved between spaces with less distinction. Their world was defined more by activity than by environment. The smells of home, of yard, of street, of animals, all blended into a continuous experience. Over time, as responsibilities grew and roles became more defined, awareness sharpened. Tasks required attention to detail, cooking, storage, care of materials, and with that attention came a more refined sense of when something was out of balance. This awareness was not necessarily articulated, but it guided behavior. A cook might notice that the air felt too close and adjust the fire or open a door. A householder might sense that stored food was beginning to turn and prioritize its use. A servant might recognize that bedding needed airing before it became uncomfortable. These were not dramatic interventions, but they were constant, shaping the environment through small, repeated acts. There is an almost quiet discipline in this. Not the discipline of strict rules, but of attentiveness. A way of living that required noticing without necessarily naming, adjusting without necessarily explaining. And within that discipline, there was a kind of resilience. The environment was not ideal, but it was understood. It is also important to consider how moments of contrast influence perception. Travel, even over relatively short distances, could introduce a person to different domestic conditions. A night spent in another household, a visit to a different town, or even time in a public space like a hall or bathhouse could shift expectations, if only briefly. Returning home after such experiences might make familiar conditions feel slightly different. Not necessarily worse, but more noticeable. The air might seem heavier, the layering of smells more apparent. These moments of contrast did not always lead to change, but they could sharpen awareness, if only for a time. And yet, that awareness often softened again as routine resumed. The home reasserted itself as the center of daily life, and with it came a return to the familiar balance. This ebb and flow between noticing and accepting is part of what makes the medieval domestic environment so difficult to capture in simple terms. It was not static, and neither was the perception of it. There were also social dimensions to this perception. Hospitality, for instance, carried with it certain expectations about the condition of the home. A host might take additional care to prepare a space for a guest, clearing, airing, arranging, in ways that went beyond the ordinary routine. These efforts were not about achieving a modern standard of cleanliness, but about presenting the home in its best possible state within existing limits. A guest, in turn, would interpret the environment through a combination of expectation, courtesy, and personal experience. What might seem heavy or layered to one person could be accepted, even appreciated by another depending on context. The act of visiting and being visited created moments where the sensory qualities of the home were more consciously experienced, even if they were not openly discussed. In larger households, particularly those of higher status, these social dynamics became more pronounced. Spaces might be prepared specifically for receiving guests, with greater attention to airing, cleaning, and arrangement. Materials such as fresh rushes, herbs, or cleaner textiles might be used to create a more favorable impression. These efforts did not eliminate the underlying conditions, but they could shift the balance enough to be noticeable. At the same time, the presence of more people, guests, servants, attendants, could itself alter the atmosphere. More bodies meant more heat, more movement, more interaction with the space. The very act of improving the appearance of the home for social purposes could introduce new layers to its sensory environment. This interplay between effort and outcome is a recurring theme. Actions taken to improve one aspect of the home often influenced others, sometimes in unexpected ways. A stronger fire might dry damp materials but increase smoke. Fresh rushes might soften the floor but begin to absorb new residues. Herbs might lighten the air but add their own presence to it. What this suggests is that the medieval home was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be managed. A condition that required constant attention, not in the form of large, decisive actions, but through an ongoing series of small adjustments. And within that ongoing process, there were moments when individuals became more acutely aware of their environment. Moments when something shifted enough to draw attention, when the balance was disturbed, or when contrast made the familiar feel unfamiliar. These moments, though often brief, offer a glimpse into how people might have experienced their homes more consciously. Not as abstract spaces, but as environments that could change, that could demand response, that could, at times, feel more or less comfortable depending on a range of factors. As we move further into these personal experiences, another layer begins to emerge, one that is less about the physical properties of the home and more about the meanings attached to them. The ways in which people interpreted what they sensed, the beliefs they held about air, cleanliness, and health, and how those beliefs shaped their responses to the very conditions we have been tracing. And it is within that layer, where perception, belief, and daily reality meet, that the story of how medieval homes smelled becomes even more complex, revealing not just an environment, but a way of understanding and living within it that continues to unfold as we look closer. Because once we step into that layer of belief and interpretation, the smell of a medieval home begins to carry meaning beyond simple discomfort. It becomes something people tried to understand, even if they did not explain it in modern scientific terms. Air was not just air. It was something that could be good or bad, healthy or harmful, balanced or corrupted. And smell was often the most immediate way of sensing that difference. The idea that foul air could cause illness, what later historians would call miasma, was not a fully developed theory in the early medieval period. But the underlying intuition was present. People observed patterns. They noticed that certain places felt unhealthy, that stagnant conditions often coincided with sickness, that decay and disease seemed to travel together. These observations were not entirely incorrect, even if the mechanisms were misunderstood. Inside the home, this meant that a shift in smell could carry a quiet sense of warning. A room that felt too close, too heavy, too unfamiliar might not just be unpleasant. It might feel unsafe in a way that was difficult to articulate but hard to ignore. This did not lead to panic, but it did encourage certain responses. Opening spaces, introducing fresh elements, adjusting the environment where possible. Herbs played a particularly interesting role here. They were used not only for their scent, but for what that scent was believed to represent. Freshness, purity, balance. Bundles of rosemary, lavender, mint, or other plants might be placed in a room, hung from beams, or scattered across floors. Their fragrance was not merely decorative. It was part of an effort to reshape the air itself, to counteract what was perceived as harmful. And yet, this effort carried its own subtle complexity. The addition of herbs did not remove the underlying conditions. It layered over them, creating an environment where multiple scents coexisted. To a modern observer, this might seem like an attempt to mask a problem. But within the medieval framework, it was more about altering the quality of the air, shifting it from one state to another. There is a quiet logic to this. If air could influence health, then improving its character, even partially, was worthwhile. The goal was not perfection, but improvement within reach. This perspective also influenced how people thought about movement through space. Fresh air, when it could be found, was valued. Time spent outdoors, especially in open or elevated areas, was seen as beneficial. Bringing that sense of openness into the home, even briefly, was part of maintaining balance. But again, this was shaped by limits. In colder weather, the desire for fresh air had to be weighed against the need for warmth. In crowded urban areas, the outside air might not feel significantly better. In times of illness, opening a space might feel risky. Every decision involved a trade-off, and those trade-offs were understood in practical, immediate terms. It is also worth considering how these beliefs interacted with social hierarchy. Access to certain materials, cleaner textiles, better fuel, imported herbs or resins, could influence how a household managed its environment. Wealthier homes might use more refined methods, but the underlying principles remained similar. They, too, worked within the idea that air could be shaped, influenced, improved, even if not fully controlled. In some cases, these efforts extended beyond the home itself. Streets might be cleaned, waste moved, public spaces maintained in ways that reflected a shared concern for environment and health. These actions were uneven, dependent on resources and organization, but they point to a broader awareness that the conditions outside the home affected those within it. And yet, despite these efforts, there remained a gap between intention and outcome. The tools available were limited, and the understanding of underlying causes was incomplete. This meant that even careful attention could not always prevent the environment from shifting in ways that felt uncomfortable or concerning. There is a quiet tension here between knowledge and limitation. People knew enough to recognize patterns, to attempt improvements, to respond to changes. but they did not have the means to fully resolve the underlying issues. The result was a kind of ongoing negotiation, guided by experience but constrained by circumstance. Within the home, this negotiation often took the form of routine reinforced by belief. Practices were repeated not only because they worked, but because they were understood to be the right thing to do. Airing bedding using herbs, managing waste, adjusting the fire, these actions carried both practical and symbolic weight. Over time, this combination of practice and belief created a sense of order, even within an environment that could never be fully controlled. The home, despite its layered atmosphere, was a place where effort was visible, where care could be demonstrated, where balance could be maintained, at least most of the time. But as we move further into this story, another dimension begins to emerge, one that sits slightly apart from both material conditions and belief. It is the question of adaptation at the sensory level itself. Not just how people managed their environment, but how their bodies and perceptions adjusted to it over time. Because what feels overwhelming to a modern visitor might not have felt the same to someone living within it every day. And understanding that difference requires us to look more closely at how familiarity shapes perception, how repeated exposure changes sensitivity, and how the human experience of smell is, in many ways, as much about memory and expectation as it is about the air itself. And it is within that subtle shift from environment to perception that the medieval home begins to reveal yet another layer of its reality, one that moves beyond what can be described and into how it was actually lived, moment by moment, breath by breath, within the quiet, persistent presence of everything that surrounded it. That shift from the physical environment to the way it was experienced changes how we understand the medieval home almost completely, because what seems overwhelming at first glance begins to soften when we consider how the human senses adapt over time. Smell, perhaps more than any other sense, is shaped by repetition. What is constant becomes less noticeable. What changes becomes significant. For someone living day after day within the same space, the layered atmosphere of the home would not present itself all at once. It would settle into the background, becoming part of what normal felt like. The smoke in the rafters, the faint dampness in the walls, the lingering presence of food and fabric. These did not disappear, but they ceased to demand attention in the same way. Instead, attention shifted to difference. A slightly sharper note in the air, a change in the way a room felt upon entering, a moment when something familiar seemed out of place. These were the cues that mattered, not the baseline condition but the deviation from it. This is why contrast becomes so important in understanding medieval sensory experience. A person stepping from the open air into a closed room would notice the shift more than the room itself. A visitor entering from another household might detect differences that the inhabitants had long since stopped registering. A change in season, a change in weather, a change in routine, each could bring certain elements of the environment into sharper focus. And over time, these moments of contrast would build a kind of internal map. Not a conscious one, but a practical sense of how different spaces and conditions felt relative to each other. A home might not be clean in a modern sense, but it might feel balanced. Another might feel heavier, less comfortable, even if the difference was subtle. There is a quiet intelligence in this way of perceiving. It does not rely on absolute standards, but on relative ones. It asks not whether a space is perfect, but whether it is better or worse than it was before, or than it might be under different conditions. This perspective also helps explain why certain improvements, even small ones, could feel meaningful. Airing a room, replacing bedding, introducing fresh herbs. These actions might not transform the environment entirely, but they created a noticeable shift. And that shift, however temporary, could restore a sense of balance. At the same time, this adaptation had its limits. When conditions changed too quickly or too dramatically, the senses could not adjust in the same gradual way. A sudden intrusion, a strong odor from outside, a rapid onset of dampness, the presence of illness would stand out sharply. It would interrupt the familiar pattern and demand attention. In these moments, the environment became more than background. It became something to be addressed, something that required action. And the response, again, would be shaped by experience. What had worked before might be tried again. What had failed might be avoided. Over time, this created a body of practical knowledge, rooted not in theory, but in lived experience. There is also an emotional dimension to this adaptation. Familiar environments, even imperfect ones, often carry a sense of comfort, not because they are ideal, but because they are known. The smell of a home, however complex, becomes part of its identity. It signals belonging, routine, stability. This does not mean that people were unaware of discomfort. Rather, it suggests that discomfort was contextual. A familiar heaviness might be accepted, even reassuring. The same heaviness in an unfamiliar place might feel oppressive. The difference lies not only in the air itself, but in the relationship between the individual and the space. This relationship could be disrupted. Illness, travel, changes in household composition, or shifts in living conditions could all alter how a space was experienced. A room that once felt normal might begin to feel different. A house that had been manageable might become more difficult to maintain. In these moments, the limits of adaptation became clear. And yet, even then, the response remained grounded in the same pattern. Recognition, adjustment, continuation. There was no expectation that the environment could be entirely remade, only that it could be managed, guided back toward a familiar range. It is also worth considering how this sensory adaptation intersected with memory. Smell is closely tied to recollection, and in a world where environments changed slowly, the scent of a home could become deeply associated with specific times, people, and experiences. A particular combination of smoke, fabric, and food might evoke not just the present, but the continuity of daily life over months and years. This continuity gave the medieval home a kind of persistence. It was not just a space, but a lived environment shaped by time. Its atmosphere carried traces of what had come before, not in a literal sense that could be easily identified, but in a general impression of familiarity. For someone returning after an absence, this could be especially noticeable. The first moment inside might bring a sudden awareness of the home's character, something that had been invisible when experienced continuously. But even that awareness would fade as the senses adjusted once more, and the environment returned to its place as background. All of this suggests that the question of how medieval homes smelled cannot be answered simply by describing their components. It must also account for how those components were experienced, how they were filtered through habit, expectation, and memory. And within that experience, there is a final, quieter layer to consider. Not just how people adapted to their environment, but how that environment, in turn, shaped their expectations of comfort, cleanliness, and normality. How it influenced what they noticed, what they ignored, and what they considered worth changing. Because once those expectations are formed, they begin to guide behavior in subtle ways, reinforcing certain practices and allowing others to persist. And it is through this ongoing interaction between environment, perception, and expectation that the character of the medieval home continues to evolve, not as a fixed condition, but as a lived experience that moves forward with each day, each season, and each small decision made within its walls. And over time, those small decisions did something quietly powerful. They did not eliminate the underlying conditions, but they shaped what people came to expect from a home. Expectation, in this sense, became its own kind of structure, less visible than walls or beams, but just as influential in defining how a space was experienced. A household that regularly aired bedding, replaced floor coverings when it could, and managed its waste with care would come to recognize a certain range of conditions as acceptable. Slight heaviness in the air, a background of smoke, the mingled presence of materials, these would all fall within that range. But anything beyond it, anything that felt noticeably different, would stand out more sharply. In another household, where resources were more limited or routines more difficult to maintain, that range might shift. What one family considered slightly uncomfortable, another might experience as normal. This did not mean that one group was indifferent and the other attentive. It meant that their expectations had been shaped by different circumstances. Over time, these expectations could become deeply ingrained. They influenced not only how people perceived their own homes, but how they judged others. Entering a different household was not just a change of space, but a moment of comparison. Sometimes subtle, sometimes more immediate. The air itself could communicate something about the care, the stability, or the pressures within that home. This kind of judgment was rarely explicit, but it existed. A space that felt well managed, even within the limits of the time, might signal reliability or competence. A space that felt more difficult, more stagnant, more layered, might suggest strain, even if the reasons were not fully visible. And yet, these impressions were always tempered by understanding. Medieval life was shaped by constraints that were widely recognized. Illness, weather, work, and circumstance could affect any household. The line between a well-kept home and a struggling one was not fixed. Could shift over time, sometimes quickly. This fluidity adds another layer to the experience of smell. It was not only a reflection of present conditions, but also of change, of how a household was managing over time. A room that felt slightly different than it had a week before might prompt attention. A gradual shift, barely noticeable day by day, might only become clear in retrospect. There is a quiet tension here between stability and change. The home, as we have seen, was a place of continuity. But it was also a place where small changes accumulated, where the balance could shift without any single dramatic event. This is particularly evident when we consider how long materials remained in use. A piece of furniture, a set of bedding, a section of flooring, these were not replaced lightly. They were used, repaired, adapted, and kept for as long as possible. Over time, they absorbed the life of the household, becoming part of its sensory identity. Replacing such materials could bring a noticeable shift. Fresh straw in a mattress, new rushes on the floor, newly washed or acquired textiles. These changes could alter the atmosphere in a way that felt significant, even if it was temporary. For a time, the air might feel lighter, the space more open. But gradually, as daily life resumed, the layering would begin again. This cycle, refreshment followed by accumulation, was part of the rhythm of the medieval home. It did not lead toward a permanent state of cleanliness, but toward a repeated process of renewal and return. Each effort to improve the environment created a moment of difference, and that difference, however brief, helped maintain the overall balance. It is also in this cycle that we begin to see how closely the home was tied to broader patterns of time. Not just the daily routine, but the larger rhythms of the year. Seasonal cleaning, the preparation for winter, the recovery after it. These moments often involved more intensive attention to the home. In spring, for example, there might be greater opportunity to air out spaces that had been closed through the colder months. Bedding could be exposed to sunlight. Floors could be cleared and refreshed. The home, after a period of relative enclosure, could be opened more fully to the outside air. These moments were not merely practical. They marked a transition, a shift in how the home was experienced. The air changed, the light changed, the balance of the space shifted. For a time, the environment might feel noticeably different, even if the underlying conditions remained. And yet, as with all such changes, this difference would gradually settle into a new normal. The senses would adjust, expectations would shift, and the process of daily management would continue. There is something deeply human in this pattern. The desire to improve one's environment, even within limits. The acceptance of imperfection, balanced by effort. The recognition that comfort is not a fixed state, but something maintained through attention and care. At the same time, this pattern reveals the limits of that effort. No matter how attentive a household might be, it could not fully separate itself from the materials, the environment, and the conditions of the time. The smells we have been tracing, smoke, dampness, organic matter, human presence, were not anomalies. They were integral to the way life was lived. And perhaps this is where the original assumption begins to shift most clearly. The idea that medieval homes smelled worse than we imagine is, in one sense, true. The layering of conditions, the lack of modern separation, the constant interaction between inside and outside, all contributed to an atmosphere that would feel unfamiliar, even overwhelming to a modern visitor. But in another sense, the comparison itself becomes less straightforward. Because those homes were not experienced from the outside. They were lived in, understood, adjusted to, and shaped over time. Their atmosphere was not an intrusion, but a condition. One that people navigated with a combination of practicality, adaptation, and quiet persistence. And as we continue to follow that persistence, we begin to see how it extended beyond individual households, influencing the broader fabric of daily life. How people organized their spaces, how they moved through their environments, and how the subtle presence of smell, always there but rarely isolated, became part of the way the medieval world itself was felt and understood from one moment to the next. And once we begin to see it that way, the home is no longer just a place where smells gathered. It becomes a place where the wider world was constantly translated into something immediate and personal. Every change in weather, every shift in work, every movement through the landscape left its trace not only on tools and clothing, but in the air itself. A person returning home at the end of the day did not simply step into a familiar space. They carried the outside with them. Damp earth clung to boots. The faint sweetness of cut hay or the sharper edge of animal labor lingered in fabric. Smoke from another hearth, encountered along the way, might follow them in unnoticed. These traces did not remain separate. They joined the existing atmosphere, becoming part of the ongoing layering that defined the home. This movement between spaces, outside to inside, public to private, happened repeatedly, and each time it slightly altered the balance. The home was never sealed long enough to become fixed. It was always in the process of receiving, absorbing, and slowly redistributing what was brought into it. In this sense, the medieval home functioned almost like a filter. It softened certain elements, held onto others, and allowed some to fade. The sharpness of the outside world might be reduced as it settled into the materials of the house, but it was not removed entirely. Instead, it became part of a more complex, blended environment. This blending had an interesting effect on how people experienced transitions. The difference between outside and inside was real, but it was not absolute. It was a shift in degree rather than a complete change. The air inside might be warmer, heavier, more stable, but it still carried echoes of what lay beyond the walls. Over time, this meant that the home did not stand apart from the world so much as reflect it in a quieter form. Seasonal changes, for example, were not only visible in the fields or the streets. They were felt within the house itself. The dampness of autumn, the enclosure of winter, the gradual lightness of spring. All of these altered the internal atmosphere in ways that were subtle but persistent. This connection becomes even clearer when we consider how work shaped domestic space. Many activities that we now associate with separate locations were once carried out within or very close to the home. Spinning, weaving, mending, food preparation, storage, small-scale craft work. Each of these brought its own materials and conditions into the living space. A day spent processing wool, for instance, might leave a faint residue in the air. Working with hides or preparing certain foods could introduce stronger, more distinct notes. Even seemingly simple tasks, repeated over time, contributed to the gradual shaping of the environment. And because these tasks were ongoing, their effects were cumulative. The home did not reset at the end of each day. It carried forward the traces of what had been done, blending them with what came next. There is a quiet continuity in this process. The smell of a home was not just a snapshot of a single moment, but a kind of slow record of recent activity. A room might carry the memory of yesterday's cooking, last week's weather, the ongoing presence of stored materials, and the immediate condition of the present moment all at once. For the people living within it, this continuity was part of what made the space intelligible. They did not need to separate each element. They understood the whole even if they could not or did not analyze it into parts. This understanding extended to how they moved within the space. Certain areas of the home might feel different from others, not only in temperature or light, but in atmosphere. A corner near the hearth might be warmer and more affected by smoke. A section near stored goods might carry a heavier, more grounded scent. Sleeping areas might feel softer, more enclosed. These differences were not always sharply defined, but they influenced behavior. People gravitated toward certain spots for certain tasks, not only because of convenience, but because of how those spaces felt. Over time, this created patterns of use that reinforced the character of each area. In this way, the home became a landscape of its own, small, enclosed, but varied. And within that landscape, the presence of smell was not uniform. It shifted, settled, and reformed depending on use, time of day, and season. This brings us to another subtle but important point. The medieval home was not experienced as a single, constant environment. It changed from morning to evening, from work to rest, from one season to another. The air itself participated in these changes, becoming lighter or heavier, sharper or softer, depending on what was happening within and around the space. Morning, for instance, might bring a slight freshness, especially if the house had been opened after the night. The air, though still layered, could feel more mobile, more responsive. By evening, after a day of activity, it might feel more settled, more concentrated. These shifts were part of the rhythm of daily life, and they shaped how people experienced their homes over time. A space that felt comfortable at one moment might feel different at another, not because it had changed dramatically, but because its balance had shifted. And within these shifts, people continued to make small adjustments, opening, closing, clearing, arranging, maintaining that ongoing negotiation we have been tracing. What emerges from all of this is a picture of the medieval home not as a static, unpleasant place, but as a dynamic environment, constantly shaped by interaction between people, materials, and the wider world. Its smells were not simply the result of neglect or limitation. They were the byproduct of a way of life in which separation was minimal and connection was constant. And as we follow that connection further, we begin to see how it extended beyond the physical environment into the rhythms of daily habit and routine, how the timing of tasks, the sequencing of activities, and the quiet structure of the day itself played a role in shaping not only what people did within their homes, but how those homes felt moment by moment as the cycle of life continued to unfold within their walls. That cycle, when looked at closely, begins to reveal something almost quiet and structured beneath what might otherwise seem like disorder. The day inside a medieval home was not random. It followed a rhythm shaped by light, labor, and necessity, and that rhythm, in turn, influenced the atmosphere of the space in ways that were both predictable and deeply familiar to those living within it. Early morning, for instance, often marked a kind of reset, not a complete one, but a partial easing. After the stillness of the night, when air had settled and everything had drawn inward, the opening of a door or shutter introduced movement again. The first stirring of the fire, the first steps across the floor, the first shift of bodies and materials, all of this gently disturbed what had accumulated. The air did not become fresh in a modern sense, but it became active again. Smoke began to rise, moisture began to shift, and the layering of the previous day was, if not removed, then redistributed. There was a sense of beginning, even if the underlying conditions remained. As the day progressed, activity increased. Cooking, movement, work, each added new elements to the environment. The home filled not just with people, but with the traces of what they were doing. And yet, because this was expected, it did not feel like a decline. It felt like the natural state of things. Midday often represented a kind of balance point. The house was in full use, the fire active, the air warm and layered, but still moving. Doors might open and close more frequently. People moved in and out. The boundary between inside and outside was at its most fluid, and with that fluidity came a certain equilibrium. It is only later, as evening approached and activity slowed, that the atmosphere began to settle again. The fire, though still present, was no longer part of continuous work. Movement decreased. Doors closed more often than they opened, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, the air began to gather once more. This daily rhythm meant that the home was never in a single, fixed state. It moved through phases, slight dispersal, gradual accumulation, partial reset, each one shaping how the space felt at different times. And because these phases repeated, they became part of the lived experience, something anticipated even if not consciously noted. There is a subtle comfort in this predictability. Even if the conditions themselves were not ideal by modern standards, their regularity provided a sense of order. People knew, in a general way, how the home would feel at different times of day. They knew when it would be easier to air a room, when it would feel heavier, when certain tasks were best done. And this knowledge influenced behavior. Washing, for example, might be timed to coincide with moments when drying was more likely to be effective. Bedding might be aired when conditions allowed, rather than at fixed intervals. Cleaning tasks might be adjusted based on how the space felt, not according to an abstract schedule. In this way, the rhythm of the day became a tool for managing the environment. Not in a precise or calculated manner, but in a responsive one. People worked with the flow of conditions rather than against it. This responsiveness extended to the sequencing of tasks. Activities that introduced stronger smells or heavier materials might be followed by actions that helped restore balance. Cooking might be followed by clearing and airing. Work with certain materials might be done earlier in the day, when movement and airflow were greater. These patterns were not universal, but they reflect a broader tendency to arrange daily life in ways that supported the maintenance of the home. There is also a quieter dimension to this sequencing, one that relates to rest. As night approached, the home shifted from a space of activity to one of containment. The very conditions that made it feel heavier, the reduced movement, the enclosed air, also contributed to warmth and stillness. For sleep, these qualities were not entirely negative. They were part of what made the space usable. This again highlights the balance at the heart of the medieval home. The same conditions that created discomfort in one context could provide comfort in another. Smoke that felt oppressive during the day could help retain warmth at night. Enclosure that limited airflow could also protect against cold. The environment was not divided into good and bad elements, but composed of trade-offs. Understanding these trade-offs is essential to understanding why the home functioned as it did. People were not simply enduring unpleasant conditions. They were navigating a set of constraints, making choices that prioritized survival, efficiency, and practicality. And within those choices, the sensory experience of the home, its smells, its textures, its atmosphere, was both a guide and a consequence. It informed decisions and it reflected them. Over longer periods, this daily rhythm connected to broader cycles. Weeks, months, and seasons all introduced their own variations. A period of sustained work might leave its mark on the environment. A time of relative quiet might allow for more thorough attention to cleaning or maintenance. The home responded not only to the immediate day, but to these extended patterns. This layering of time, daily, seasonal, and occasional, created a depth to the experience of the home that is easy to overlook. It was not just a place where things happened, but a place where the effects of those happenings accumulated, interacted, and gradually shaped the environment. And as those layers built up, they also created opportunities for change. Moments when the usual rhythm was interrupted by travel, by celebration, by necessity, could shift the balance in noticeable ways. A gathering might bring more people, more heat, more movement, altering the atmosphere for a time. A period of absence might allow a space to settle differently, only to change again upon return. These variations remind us that the medieval home was not static, even in its most familiar aspects. It was always in motion, always adjusting, always responding to the lives lived within it. And it is within that motion, within the steady repetition of daily routines and the quieter shifts that accompanied them, that we begin to see how deeply the sensory character of the home was tied to time itself, to the unfolding of each day and each season, and to the countless small decisions that shaped not only how people lived, but how their world, in its most immediate form, felt around them as it continued to evolve. And within that slow evolution, there is one more layer that begins to emerge almost quietly once everything else has been understood. The way the home did not simply contain life, but gradually took on its character. Not just in how it looked or how it functioned, but in how it felt over time, in ways that were difficult to separate from the people who lived there. Because after months, then years of continuous use, the medieval home became something more than a structure. It became saturated with patterns. Not only patterns of movement and routine, but patterns of presence. The repeated use of certain areas, the consistent placement of objects, the habitual paths taken across the floor, these did not just shape behavior. They shaped the environment itself. A bench near the hearth, used every evening, would gather warmth, soot, and the subtle imprint of bodies over time. A section of floor near the entrance, crossed repeatedly with boots and tools, would develop a different texture, a different responsiveness to moisture. A corner used for storage might carry a deeper, more settled atmosphere, shaped by stillness rather than movement. These differences were not always visible in a clear way, but they were felt. They contributed to a sense that each part of the home had its own quiet identity, formed not by design, but by repetition. And this is where the experience of smell becomes even more personal. Because these layered, localized conditions meant that the atmosphere of a home was not uniform. It shifted subtly from place to place, from moment to moment, depending on how the space was used. A person moving through the home would pass through these variations without necessarily noticing them consciously. But over time, they would come to understand them. Certain areas might feel more comfortable for rest, others more suited to work. Some spaces might feel heavier, others slightly more open. These impressions were shaped by many factors, but the air itself was always part of that experience. There is a quiet intimacy in this relationship. The home was not simply occupied. It was known in a way that extended beyond sight or touch. It was recognized through habit, through memory, through the subtle cues that accumulated over time. And because of this, change within the home could feel deeply personal, even when it was caused by external factors. A shift in weather that altered the air, a change in routine that affected how a space was used, the introduction or removal of materials, these did not just modify the environment. They altered something familiar. This helps explain why certain moments of change could stand out so clearly. not because they were dramatic, but because they disrupted a long-established pattern. A room that felt slightly different than expected, a space that no longer responded in the usual way. These changes could draw attention precisely because they contrasted with what had been known. At the same time, the home itself had a kind of resilience. It absorbed these changes, adjusted to them, and gradually incorporated them into a new pattern. What felt unfamiliar at first could become normal again, given enough time and repetition. This process, disruption followed by adjustment, mirrors the larger patterns we have been tracing. It reflects the same balance between stability and change, between familiarity and adaptation, that defines the medieval domestic environment as a whole. But there is also a deeper implication here. If the home could take on the character of those who lived within it, then it also became a reflection of their lives in a more enduring way. The traces left behind were not just temporary. They accumulated, layer by layer, creating an environment that carried a sense of continuity even as individual moments passed. In this sense, the smell of a medieval home was not just about the present. It was, in a quiet and diffuse way, about the past as well. Not in a form that could be clearly identified, but in the overall impression of the space, a kind of lingering presence shaped by everything that had happened within it. For those living there, this presence would not have been experienced as something separate. It was simply part of the home itself. But for a visitor or for someone returning after a long absence, it might be more noticeable. A reminder that the space had its own history, its own continuity. This continuity was not static. It changed slowly, responding to the ongoing life of the household. New materials replaced old ones. New routines emerged. New conditions shaped the environment. But the process was gradual, and because of that, it maintained a sense of coherence. And within that coherence, the sensory experience of the home remained consistent enough to feel stable, even as it evolved. It is here that the idea of the medieval home as an unpleasant place becomes more difficult to sustain in simple terms. Not because the conditions were ideal, but because they were integrated into a system of living that made sense within its own context. The smells, the textures, the atmosphere, all of these were part of a larger whole, one that was understood, managed, and adapted to over time. This does not diminish the differences between that world and our own. The contrast remains real, but it shifts the focus from judgment to understanding. From asking how bad it was to asking how it functioned, how it was experienced, and how people lived within it. And as we continue to follow that question, the medieval home begins to reveal itself not as a static environment defined by discomfort, but as a living space, dynamic, responsive, and deeply connected to the rhythms of life that unfolded within it. Which brings us gradually toward another point of view, one that looks not only at how these homes were experienced from within, but how they were described, remembered, and sometimes misunderstood by those who encountered them from the outside, whether as travelers, observers, or later storytellers trying to make sense of a world that no longer felt familiar. And it is through those outside perspectives that the medieval home often begins to look more extreme than it might have felt from within. Travelers, especially those moving between regions or across cultural boundaries, sometimes recorded their impressions in ways that emphasize contrast. What struck them most was not the everyday balance, but the difference, the moment when one environment gave way to another that felt heavier, sharper, or simply unfamiliar. A person accustomed to one set of domestic conditions might enter a different town or region and notice what the inhabitants themselves had long since adapted to. The layering of smoke, the closeness of air, the mingled presence of materials, these could stand out sharply to someone encountering them for the first time. And because these impressions were often recorded precisely for their novelty, they tend to preserve the sense of surprise more than the sense of familiarity. There is a subtle distortion in this, not an intentional one, but a natural consequence of perspective. What is constant for one person becomes remarkable for another. And when those remarks are written down, they can shape how later generations imagine the entire environment. But even within these accounts, there are moments that suggest something more nuanced. Observers do not always describe these homes as chaotic or unlivable. More often, they note the differences in arrangement, in material, in the way space is used. The smells are part of that description, but they are rarely isolated from the broader context. They are one element among many, contributing to an overall impression rather than defining it entirely. Later interpretations, however, sometimes draw more heavily on those sensory details, especially when trying to contrast the past with the present. The medieval home becomes a kind of symbol, a place where everything is imagined to be heavier, darker, more difficult. And while there is truth in the difference, the lived experience behind it can become simplified. What is often lost in that simplification is the balance we have been tracing. The way people adjusted to their environment, the way they understood its rhythms, the way they maintained a workable equilibrium within its limits. The smell of the home, in this broader picture, is not just a sign of discomfort. It is a sign of connection between people, materials, and the conditions of their time. This becomes clearer when we consider how people themselves describe their surroundings in more practical or familiar terms. Household instructions, occasional literary references, even casual mentions in letters or records. These rarely dwell on the atmosphere of the home as something extraordinary. They refer to it indirectly, through actions. Cleaning, airing, arranging, managing. This absence is telling. It suggests that the sensory qualities of the home, including its smells, were not always the most important aspect of how it was understood. They were present, certainly, but they were integrated into a larger set of concerns. And yet, the fact that these qualities were so integrated does not mean they were insignificant. On the contrary, they were deeply embedded in daily life, shaping experience in ways that were rarely separated out or analyzed on their own. There is a quiet parallel here with how we experience our own environments. The most constant elements often receive the least attention, precisely because they are always there. It is only when something changes or when we encounter a different setting that we become more aware of them. In the medieval context, this awareness might arise during travel, illness, seasonal change, or social interaction. In those moments, the familiar becomes visible, not because it has changed completely, but because it is being seen from a slightly different angle. And it is through these moments of shifted perspective that we can begin to reconstruct how these homes might have felt, not just in terms of their physical conditions, but in terms of their place within the broader experience of life. Because ultimately, the medieval home was not defined by a single quality. It was defined by the interplay of many factors: material, environmental, social, and perceptual. Its smells were part of that interplay, inseparable from the rest. As we follow this line of thought further, the focus begins to move once again, from how these environments were described or imagined, back toward how they were inhabited, but now with a slightly different emphasis. Not just on the physical or sensory experience, but on the ways in which that experience shaped behavior, routine, and even the structure of daily decisions. And it is within that return, back into the lived, habitual space of the home, that we begin to see how something as subtle as the air itself could influence the flow of life in ways that were rarely acknowledged directly, but were felt in the timing of actions, the arrangement of space, and the quiet, continuous effort to maintain a place that, despite everything, remained livable. Because when we step back from the details, the smoke, the dampness, the layered presence of materials, we begin to see something more complete. A home that functioned within limits, certainly, but one that was not chaotic or neglected in the way it is often imagined. It was managed. It was worked on. It was lived in with attention, even if that attention looked very different from what we expect today. The smell, which at first seems like the defining feature, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a signal, not just of what was present in the room, but of how life itself was being carried out within it. Of what had been cooked, what had been stored, what had been endured, what had been maintained. And perhaps more importantly, it becomes a reminder that comfort is not absolute. It is relative, shaped by expectation, by habit, and by the boundaries of what is possible. For a modern viewer, the atmosphere of a medieval home might feel heavy, even overwhelming. But for the people who lived within it, it was familiar. It was workable. It was, in its own way, home. That does not mean it was always pleasant. There were moments when the balance shifted too far, when dampness lingered, when waste accumulated, when illness altered the air in ways that could not be ignored. But those moments were part of a broader pattern, one that included recovery, adjustment, and the gradual return to a more stable state. And that pattern is what gives the medieval home its quiet resilience. Not perfection, but persistence. Not cleanliness in the modern sense, but care within constraint. So when we return to the idea that medieval homes smelled worse than we imagine, the answer is both simple and more complex than it first appears. Yes, the conditions were different. Yes, the layering of daily life created an atmosphere that would feel unfamiliar to us. But that atmosphere was not an accident. It was the result of a world in which people lived closer to their materials, closer to their environment, and closer to the realities of survival. And within that world, they created spaces that worked, not by removing every imperfection, but by learning how to live with them. Which is why, in the end, the medieval home is perhaps best understood not through the lens of discomfort alone, but through the lens of adaptation. A place where the air itself told a story, not just of limitation, but of how people met those limitations with quiet, persistent effort. And if you've been listening this far, you might find yourself wondering something slightly different now. Not just how these homes smelled, but what it would have felt like to live within that rhythm, to move through those spaces day after day, until what once seemed overwhelming became simply part of the world around you. If you've enjoyed this kind of calm, thoughtful journey into the past, you can always let me know what details stayed with you most, or what corner of history you'd like to explore next. And if you'd like more of these quiet explorations, subscribing is a simple way to keep them coming.